Welcome to the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast, presented by the Beef Cattle Research Council, the most popular content from beefresearch.ca, available on the go. Before we get into today's episode, a quick message from the BCRC. Understanding feed quality is paramount to maintaining animal health and welfare and can even help beef producers save money. Feed quality cannot be accurately assessed by simply looking at it, and feed testing should be performed prior to feeding. Having accurate feed test results can help to avoid sneaky production problems caused by mineral deficiencies or excesses, prevent or identify potentially devastating problems due to anti-nutritional factors, develop appropriate rations, identify nutritional gaps, and economize feeding. The BCRC has 2 free interactive tools that can help to evaluate the economic value of feeds based on nutrient content and assess the nutritive value of a single feed. Links to both calculators can be found in the show notes. This episode is titled Polycrop Potential: 12 Tips for Using Mixed Forage Crops. Polycrops, intercrops, cover crops, and cocktail crops are different terms that all encompass planting mixed crop species for livestock feed. Proponents of polycrops have found that mixing different plant species when growing crops can help improve soils by adding more root systems, microbiological communities, and organic matter. Compared to single species crops, polycrops may also show resilience against pests and disease. While benefits are well publicized, as with any farming practice, trying something new requires a realistic approach. Jocelyn Velistuck operates a multi-generational family farm with her husband, 2 children, and her in-laws. The mixed grain and commercial cow-calf operation in southeast Saskatchewan has used polycrops for a few years. Jocelyn, who has a background in soil science research, was excited to include polycrops in the rotations. We had to figure out how to get our land to be more productive, so I started learning about intercrops and polycrops, she says. When we were first deciding whether we wanted to jump into them with both feet, we had many conversations, she adds. Jocelyn admits she was somewhat skeptical because there wasn't a lot of science backing some of the polycrop claims. They had an opportunity to try polycrops when they rented a new field that needed some improvements. She describes, there had been heavy tilling. It was definitely hurting that spongy organic matter was missing, she says. Nutrients were non-existent. There was a very low nutrient supply in our soil. So knowing all this, my husband and I asked, how are we going to be profitable? They decided the lowest risk way they could incorporate polycrops was with an annual blend that they would make into silage bales. Jocelyn reasons, I can put whatever in there as long as we get the material. I wanted to make sure we were adding root systems, she says. My goals were centered in getting that rhizosphere and getting that soil working again. We did try some kale and clovers and did a mix of cereals with oats and barley together, and it didn't turn out really great. She admits adding that flea beetles knocked out the kale, which was supposed to make the bulk of the material. It did still make decent feed in spite of not being as productive as they hoped. The following year, they decided to simplify the mix more. She says, we kept with red clover, oats, and barley, which make great feed with huge production. She also adds that in doing so, they found less rust in the cereals compared to when they were grown as monocultures. In spite of having some past successes with polycrops, this year the Velistuck simplified their cropping decisions even more and decided to stick with straight barley. With the price of barley being so high and not knowing how your crop is going to be, if we have enough silage and green feed, then we can combine the rest, Jocelyn explains. Dr. Bart Lardner with the University of Saskatchewan says his team has been looking at polycrops since they started gaining popularity around 5 to 10 years ago. The principle behind the polycrops is to keep the land covered for longer throughout the growing season and into the dormant season, he says. Along came the different new mixtures, species, and blends, with some that may or may not have been adopted to Western Canada, Lardner adds. You can get pretty well anything you can dream up in that mixture, and you'll see mixtures from that 3 species to 27 species, Lardner says. I always challenge producers, if you buy the complex versus simple mixtures, are you sure that species 17 or 23 gave you anything for biomass? If you're paying for it, you want to make sure it works, Lardner says. Through collaboration between the Livestock and Forage Centre of Excellence and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Lardner and his team are assessing polycrop mixtures at 2 different Saskatchewan sites for yield, biomass, and quality. The research compares 3 treatments of single oat monoculture, a simple 4-species mix of oats, peas, and hairy vetch, and a complex mix with 8 species, including red poso millet, teff grass, chicory, and barley to the 4-species mix. After looking at the results, Lardner found that the yields were quite comparable among all 3 treatments of oat, 4-species, and 8-species mix, coming in at around 2 tons of dry matter per acre during some very dry conditions. We also saw some pretty good crude protein of 13 to 14% and lower NDF of around 46 to 48%. We're seeing more root biomass with these polys than monocultures. He says, adding that in the short term, they've noticed in areas that previously had low soil organic carbon, the polycrops have increased those levels. This continuing study will assess data to determine whether the different mixes yielded different greenhouse gas emissions from animals during grazing. Scientists will also continue to look at soil organic carbon changes over time. So here are the 12 tips for using polycrop mixes. Number 1, start out with simple mixes. Maybe think twice about buying the 20-species mix, says Lardner. Go simple, so you're sure when you seed them, you can see the evidence that they are contributing to the yield. Livestock agrees and says they try to use plants that they know are already adapted to their area. Tip number 2. Start with a smaller scale. Don't go crazy and seed a whole quarter. Maybe start with 10 or 20 acres, see how that blend works depending on where you're at, and see how they'll yield, says Lardner. Tip number 3, aim for success. Jocelyn performs soil tests and chooses a customized fertilizer blend to meet their specific needs. We fertilize pretty good, we don't cheap out, that has to feed our cows, she says. Tip number 4, Lardner advises producers to feed test prior to grazing or feeding polycrops. Farmers should be aware that if they plan to use polycrops for fall or winter grazing, depending on the class of animal, they may need to supplement their herd for energy, which can negate any savings. Tip number 5, be mindful of the percentage of species type in the mix and how that can impact forage quality. For example, Dr. Lardner has experience suggesting you don't want more than 20% of brassicas in the mix. With too many in there, you can see issues with elevated levels of sulfur, nitrates, elevated levels of potassium, which is antagonistic with magnesium, he explains. Tip number 6, consider pre- and post-polycrop weed control. With polycrop, you can't spray in crop, so if you have noxious weeds or those that want to linger, it might take more herbicides later on to help you gain control, Jocelyn explains. We've always had challenges with weed pressure, and some can have anti-quality factors, Lardner agrees. Tip number 7, use what you have. For mixing and seeding polycrops, the Valley Stucks opt to use equipment already on hand. For mixing seed species, we all use a mix mill and we seed it all with our air drill, explains Jocelyn. Tip number 8, strike a balance with seed depth when seeding multiple species. Jocelyn says with their polycrops, they seed everything relatively shallow but still at a depth of around 3/4 of an inch. It needs to be into moisture, she recommends. Tip number 9, avoid grazing fields before freeze-up. One season, the Valley Stucks included winter triticale in their green feed mix with the idea that the triticale would be a post-silage cover crop. Once we took the silage off, the triticale did come up and we grazed the stuff that was fenced, but those hooves on stubble really packed down the soil, she cautions. Tip number 10, be aware that polycrops may require special business management. Jocelyn notes that ag risk management programs may not support polycrops as easily as single-species commodity crops. Farmers need to determine whether polycrop benefits outweigh the risk of growing a crop that potentially cannot be insured. Tip number 11, keep an open mind on the end use of polycrops. Producers may use the crop for silage or for green manure. That's an opportunity, Lardner says. Polycrops can also be used for grazing as a standing crop or for baled feed. And tip number 12, remember perennial forage blends are polycrops too. Some of the greatest successes on the livestock farm have been incorporating perennial forage mixes into shorter term rotations. They've used oats underseeded to yellow blossom sweet clover, sainfoin, bromes, slender wheatgrass, and timothy. The goal was short-term forages meant to be in for 3 to 5 years. But when it's producing so well, it's hard to take out of production. It's year 6 and it's still looking really good. The benefits that polycrops provide may make some suitable for many farms in the short or even long term. However, there are a lot of variables that go into cropping decisions. It really depends on a lot. What our financials are looking like, what our business priorities or challenges are that year, what the markets are doing, what world stuff is going on, says Jocelyn. Science can sometimes be dealing with averages, so there is no prescription for farming, and everyone must adapt the science to their own farm circumstances. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. You can find all relevant links and information at beefresearch.ca or in the show notes. The Beef Cattle Research Council is funded by the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff and strives for excellence in the production of Canadian beef, cattle, and forage through research, innovation, and extension. Tune in every Tuesday as the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast delivers straightforward insights, expert information, and a wealth of practical knowledge for Canadian beef producers. Subscribe now.